Hello, folks. This is Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson, and we're here at WJOP 96.3 FM Joppa Radio. You can also catch my show on SoundCloud as well as on YouTube. Today's April 16th. And for a lot of folks, yesterday was tax day, April 15th, but yet if you're in Massachusetts, tax day is today. And yet, for many who don't know, Washington, D.C. actually extended the tax deadline to tomorrow, which is April 17th. And part of this has to do with the fact that today is Emancipation Day. A lot of folks don't know about Emancipation Day. Recognizing the enduring cultural and historical significance of the Emancipation Proclamation in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. This day, this anniversary is designed to commemorate President Abraham Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation of the District of Columbia. And by doing this, what it did was it compensated the enslaved by granting them their freedom through the Emancipation Act, established under the notion of the first freed on this day in 1862. So we want to lean into the funk and celebrate that. I don't know about you, but as a black man, I appreciate my freedom. I appreciate the freedom that has been granted to me. And one of the things that I do, particularly in the courses that I teach, the lectures that I give, and the way that I engage in discussions and conversations, is that I remind folks that freedom oftentimes looks different from different people. And as we think about that, one of the things we want to talk about this evening is this notion of evangelical Christianity, race, and racism. And so for me, for those of you who know me, a lot of my scholarship, a lot of the research that I do, the work that I've done, particularly in terms of my days back working for the Christian Century magazine, writing different articles that juxtapose historical phenomena with modern day patterns that ingratiates patterns and realities that really deal with the construction of race under the guise of Christianity, particularly that of evangelical Christianity. In my class, when I bring up the word evangelical, oftentimes my students have no idea what the word evangelical means. And I would even go beyond my students. A lot of folks they're slowed by that term in many ways. They're not sure what it means. Have to kind of delve into explaining about being an evangelical and what does being an evangelical means in terms of spreading the gospel, the good news of Jesus. I'm not here to proselytize. I'm an academic. And what I do is I kind of delve into the funk of discourse. I look at patterns of phenomena, speaking of, that deals with issues of race, racism, ideology, particularly as it's situated in the 20th century here of the United States. That's what I do in terms of U.S. history. That's what I do as a scholar. That's what I do as a thinker, as an activist, as a learned individual, and someone who is well-versed, well-read, and someone who has a bit of a history and a pattern when it comes to evangelical culture and society. You know, I'll start off not with my academic credentials, not with my publications, not with all those other things that you can just find on my CV. But the reality, of course, is that I was once part of the evangelical Christian culture, being a brother from Montgomery, Alabama, who attended a religious independent school that really inculcated all kind of aspects and values dealing with evangelical Christianity. I learned quite a bit. I took religion courses, they call them Bible classes, every year of my high school career. Learned a good little bit. Didn't always agree in terms of the patterns that it was taught at my school, especially because it was denominational. Church of Christ. And so they had a bit of a lean, a bend, like we all do, in terms of the particular messaging that's being disseminated, the things that were being taught. When I arrived at the school that I attended, for example, I heard things such as, you should not consume alcohol. You should not. I was like, wow, that's news to me. I mean, I'm a brother who comes from a community where, I didn't drink when I was young, and my parents didn't drink a whole lot either. But yet that's just something people did in terms of their own terms. I learned that Jesus turned water into wine. There are a lot of festivals and celebrations around that. So I'm clearly taking a reductionist approach to this, meaning that I'm simplifying it, but I think you get really the meaning of what I'm talking about. I remember conversations about you should not dance with someone of the opposite sex if you're not married. My favorite, of course, within the Church of Christ traditions is that folks should not go swimming together. It causes lust and sin. And the word they used, which I found quite humorous back then, was mixed bathing. My favorite, of course, of all things was the fact that you could be a Christian, you could accept Jesus into your soul, into your heart, and those are the things you can do. But unless you were fully immersed in baptism, you are not a Christian. And so you can see how some folks, even folks who are Christian, even folks who are evangelical Christians, would probably have some disagreement with that element within the Stone Campbell movement, or the churches of Christ, as we most know best. For me, growing up in the Deep South, we were surrounded by churches. Churches in the Deep South were pretty much like Dunkin' Donuts are here in New England. There is 1, 2, or 3 on every single corner, and it's almost like a menu. If you don't like the church on Wednesday, man, you could probably find a different one on Sunday that fits your style or your outfit or whatever the kind of soul that you have that is important to you. Those are the things that kind of define the culture. Another thing that tended to define it, particularly if we're talking about the Deep South, and again, you can find some of this up in New England, especially in Massachusetts, in terms of the puritanical culture, is for the longest time, we had a lot of blue laws. So if you were in a certain county, you could only purchase, say, alcohol after, say, noon on Sunday, or you couldn't purchase alcohol at all on Sunday, nor could you purchase it on a holiday, such as if you celebrate Christmas or Thanksgiving or all of those traditional things that have some kind of connection to Christianity, then those are the things that kind of define these notions that are there. And they were really kind of promulgated by notions of evangelicalism. A few years ago, I remember giving a lecture, and one of the things that I talked about in my lecture was evangelical culture and those folks who were evangelical warriors for the progress and the good of Jesus, especially when it came to ending slavery, for example, when it came to bringing about some notion of sanctity for the human being, for the human culture. All of those things are there. But I won't delve into all of that because, this is a lecture course. It's a seminar course. There are a lot of readings and so many things when it comes to the spiritual realm of being evangelical. And I do want to go ahead and say this. Not every Christian defines themselves as evangelical Christians. But for our point here on Race Matters, I really want to particularly lean into notions of evangelical culture, especially when it comes to white Christianity, white evangelical Christians in the United States, because there are a lot of categories, right? We can kind of really ponder the nomenclature that kind of defines what this means. We know white evangelical Christians in the U.S., they've played a huge role in shaping the political and social landscape, often intertwined with their religious beliefs and their values. with that being the case, though, discussions surrounding racism within this community, within this evangelical community, have garnered attention, particularly in light of historical and contemporary instances of racial prejudice and discrimination and systemic oppression that has happened, that has come to define the United States along the color line. Again, as we think about Emancipation Day, right, we think about the role in which religion, particularly evangelical Christianity, played in the enslavement of millions and millions of black folks. And then following the enslavement of millions of black folks, you get to the age of Jim Crow. You get to the age of the new Jim Crow. You get to the age of systemic elements that are there that continue to oppress black and brown people, often led by evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians, particularly in terms of thinking about the historical scholarship, the contemporary scholarship, in terms of why that's an element that's there. You know, one of the things that I want to delve into here, particularly on this show, and as we think about notions of race matters in evangelical Christianity, is the fact that there are shapers that really formulate the dynamics of racism within white evangelical Christianity, right? We have to go back to things such as examining its roots. We have to look at the manifestations and the potential avenues for addressing the challenges that are there, and those challenges that really have unfolded in creating some angst, some turmoil, some hesitation here in the 21st century. My students, when I throw out the word evangelical, when I assign them readings that deal with this, because this is something that I teach quite a bit in my courses, they get nervous. They always assign evangelical Christianity as being somewhat of a Southern phenomenon. They assign it to being just a white Southern phenomenon, and those things are not the case whatsoever. It's much broader in context than that. You know, to understand, speaking of the context here, right, you know, to understand the relationship between white evangelical Christians and racism, I believe more than anything that it's crucial to contextualize this within a historical framework. Right? The history of evangelicalism in the U.S. intersects with racial issues, notably during periods such as slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and the civil rights movement. It is safe to say that Brother Martin Luther King Jr. was an evangelical Christian. So not all evangelical Christians were nor are white. And the typical notion when we think about the white evangelical Christian is that they're all racist or bigots. They take different positionalities on things, but that's not true either. I can think about the late Rachel Evans, who passed away a few years ago. And that white soul sister was just an amazing white evangelical Christian who spoke on the progress of women, the progress of queer folks, on the progress and the need to ally with BIPOC folks. Rachel was great. Another person, right, that I just want to name drop here for a second is Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace continues to write a lot of great stuff, particularly for the Christian Century magazine. He has a number of books that are out there too. He talks about his narrative growing up in Detroit, Michigan, and experiencing issues of race firsthand. And I think even if I'm getting this right, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, Jim Wallace talks about what it meant to be one of the few white folks in his community growing up, particularly as a white evangelical Christian, and engaging in black folks and really learning to navigate that space there too. While some evangelical leaders champion things such as abolition and civil rights, for example, and there are countless ones. Here in Newburyport, probably one of the greatest white evangelical Christians would be William Lloyd Garrison. His home is still here in Newburyport. There's a statue of him right at the center of Newburyport. There is a hotel right by that statue known as the Garrison Inn, named after him. He's someone who talked about how Jesus called him to be an advocate for the emancipation, for the abolition of black folks, ending the racial strife that really has dawned on the United States. We can go on and think about a lot of white evangelical folks during the American Civil Rights period, particularly between the period of 1954 and 1965. And we can even extend that for a few more years too. That's one population of folks. Others justified and perpetuated racial hierarchies through theological interpretations that sanction inequality, oftentimes looking to biblical scriptures to justify why Jim Crow segregation was a must, how the word of Jesus really prompted folks to think about how we should live in segregated societies, why we should not intermarry, for example, or date interracially along those lines too. And so we've seen some problematic patterns when it comes to evangelical Christianity, particularly white evangelical Christianity. So I wanted to really be really objective, wholly objective, as we think about the fact that this is not a cut and clear narrative when we think about that population. You know, we think about the manifestation of racism, especially within the evangelical population. We know that racism within that population is manifested in various forms, ranging from explicit acts of prejudice to subtle systemic biases. Explicit racism may include charged rhetoric, discriminatory practices, or overt support for policies that disproportionately harm marginalized racial groups. In the ways in which we've recently seen that, for example, is we know that statistically in a lot of noted think tanks, particularly the Pew Research Center, has done some surveys among white evangelical Christians and have found that they believe in a lot of things that would be in diametrical opposition to the narrative that racial groups, BIPOC folks, would not adhere to. The best example I could give, obviously, is voting and supporting policies and political leaders who support voter suppression in the 21st century, removing guardrails that protect Black and brown and indigenous and other folks from discriminatory practices that are there. We know, of course, that systemic racism operates within institutional structures, influencing access to resources, opportunities, and representation. And with these things, there's a lot of evidence out there, particularly in terms of the role that white evangelical Christians have played in terms of the manifesting these patterns. You know, within evangelical spaces, this can look homogenous in some ways, right? So speaking of homogenous, let's think about homogenous congregations that lack the type of diversity in terms of leadership position, attendance, participatorial practices that are there. And of course, the fact that oftentimes some neglect racial justice issues of theological discourse because it doesn't align with their what I would call religious ideological patterns that are there. These are things that we've seen take place. And I think it's important for people to think about this. There are so many books, and I'm going to get to a few here in a second, that really explores the realm and importance of how evangelical Christians have driven both political and social discourse within the United States. You know, couple works I think about would be Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity in racism. That's one. John Fea's Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. And then there's Thomas Kidd's book, Who is an evangelical? The history of a movement in crisis. I have all of these books on my shelf in my office, and I can attest that they're worth it. You know, one of my favorites, dating back to over a decade ago, is by Edward Bloom, The Color of Christ, where he really explores the racial dynamics in terms of the analysis and interpretation of what Jesus looks like in whether he was the savior of all people, or did he become transformed into this notion of whiteness to appease white evangelical culture? You know, some other scholars, right? I'm going to go ahead and continue to name drop on a couple other prominent folks who delve into evangelical circles. So for those of you who think about this stuff, Mark Knoll is a big one. I think he may be retired or maybe at an emeritus status out of Notre Dame for a long period of time. And he's really explored this. I have a couple of books on my bookshelf where he really examines some of the patterns of race, culture, and society within within contemporary American society. George Marsden, David Bebbington, and again, I mentioned Thomas Kidd a little earlier as being some of those folks who tend to define the movement of theological and historical framing. Athnetha Butler is another great one. She is an African-American woman who really takes an interesting critique of white evangelical culture. And one of the things that she argues is that it's not a simply religious group at all, thinking about white evangelical Christian culture. Okay? She's saying just to kind of group them all together, to coalesce all of white evangelical groups together is muddy, and it's not that simple. So she would contend that it's not a simple religious group at all, but in fact, a nationalistic political movement. And I think that folks only have to look at the news, read the newspaper, kind of chime in the NPR, listen to some of the messaging that's taking place, particularly from even leaders themselves, speaking for certain political officials who practice really ambiguous messaging about Jesus and whiteness and how we congregate as human beings. Those things are there. Another thing that she argues, of course, dealing with evangelicals, is that evangelicals have defined themselves in the ubiquity of supporting the Republican Party. The Republican Party has become the white evangelical party, and they've kind of defined themselves that way. Does that mean that all white evangelicals are Republicans? Does it mean that all white evangelicals are Republicans who support cutting back on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or practicing the disenfranchisement and really advancing systemic racial policies? Not at all. How do I know? Trust me, because I published a book with a devoted evangelical Christian. I've written articles with evangelical Christians. I've given lectures and sat on panels with white evangelical Christians who do not subscribe to any of those things that I just framed there. So intellectually, I think it's important that we keep that in mind as we really delve into notions of all evangelical Christians or white conservatives who support Republican policies that aim to disenfranchise black people or oppress queer folks or women, and we can go on and on. I would say they really launch into how do we defend the status quo of patriarchy, and what does it mean to be not only in a white supremacist land, but also in a male supremacist land that propagates cultural hegemony, right? And really thinks about that cultural hegemony from a nationalistic perspective. And this has made evangelicals, for all intents and purposes, culturally and politically white. I was looking for this, and I failed to make note of it before the show. A few years ago, after the election of Donald Trump, I think it was in The Atlantic, which tends to lean towards a little bit more of a progressive news outlet, really great news outlet, write a lot of wonderful stuff. But they talked about how after the 2016 election, you saw black evangelical Christians leaving a white church. And for a long period of time, white churches were undeniably white. And they worked to, how do we congregate and bring black people in? But yet what they found, of course, particularly what black people found, is as they engaged within the white evangelical church, they no longer felt safe. They never felt like it was for them. You know, Butler argued, and one of the things that she said was that racism and the quest for political power is something that has defined evangelicals for the past 50 years. And I would say that is spot on. I mean, you can really trace this back, going back to the 1950s, starting with the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954, where the Supreme Court ruled that we need desegregation. So one of the things that started to pop up, and this is particularly true in the Deep South, there are lots of them in my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, was what we call segregation academies. And these segregation academies were evangelical Christian schools that were started in the basement of evangelical white Christian churches. And one of the things that the federal government couldn't do at that particular point is desegregate them. They only admitted white students, particularly for families who are afraid of having their white students sitting in class next to black folks, right? They were essentially not in favor of anything dealing with desegregation. You know, while evangelicals often like to emphasize the proudest moral and racial moments of their past, right? And evangelical Christians will do that. I hear it all the time. One of the things that we know, of course, is that they sometimes fall short by their own collective self-esteem issues and collective consciousness of the contradictions that define their guidance towards progress. One of the things we know, of course, and one of the things that's true, and one of the things that's happening among all churches, is that many of them have been really reflecting and examining whiteness. And they've had to do a lot of soul searching. And that's also true for the white evangelical church, too. You know, I mean, and part of that, when we think about the patterns of white evangelical history, their history is not driven so much always by Jesus, but really by the reality, the truth of the things that we do know. Slavery, the lost cause, Jim Crow, lynching, all of those things have been celebratorial factors that have really created this dark shadow among evangelicals. And that dark shadow is one of those things that even today in the 21st century, evangelicals are having a hard time combating and pushing away, mainly because they've kind of engaged in systemic practices that some people would say look like patterns of white supremacy in the political realm. And again, it goes back to Butler's argument. And part of that argument is the fact that white evangelicals have codified themselves in a way to be driven more by nationalistic political trends and an agenda than WWJD. And we all know that notion, that acronym of what would Jesus do? Evangelical Christians have a long history of being in opposition to a number of things, especially contemporary issues such as it's important that we understand systemic racism by not becoming a colorblind population. But yet one of the things that we've seen advance, particularly in white evangelical churches, is that we should operate under the guise of being colorblind. One of the biggest things, right, going back to the fact that I mentioned about the churches and the academy, the segregated academies and schools, has to do with interracial marriage. And that's a topic for another show. And that's something that's been on my list to address for a long period of time, because that requires a lot of depth and nuance in exploring the challenges to interracial marriages here in the United States. Evangelical Christians for a long time pushed against interracialness, right? And that connects to the whole notion of being against desegregating schools, wanting to keep schools segregated out of fear of interracial marriage. I'll give you an example. So I'm married to a white sister, been married to a white sister for a long time. And I remember when I was dating this white sister, we would go to her hometown in Russellville, Arkansas. Yeah, Russellville, Arkansas. And being in Russellville, Arkansas, one of the things that we know is that, and I just looked up these stats, that, there's some black folks there. I mean, it's in the deep South. The total population in Arkansas, in terms of being black, is about 15%, which is roughly almost 2% higher, not unusual being in the South, than the national average of black people, which is around 13%, 13.5, 6%, around that. And the thing that we heard, my wife now, back when we were dating and preparing to get married, was the fact that there were some people who were, they were not happy that me, a black man, was about to marry a white woman whose father was a minister in this church in this town of Russellville, Arkansas. And so the pulpit minister, a guy by the name of Dan Lightfoot, got wind of some of the concerns, people coming to his office saying that Jesus said, or the Bible said, that it was a sin for people to mix race, to marry, to date interracially. And I'll give a shout out to Dan, and I still have his sermon on tape. My wife and I were not in the pulpit, well, not in the pulpit, in the pews, correct myself, my language. We were not in the pews at the time. But Jeanette's mom, dad, recorded the sermon and sent us the tape of Dan Lightfoot's sermon. And in his sermon, he talked about, when he studied scripture, that Jesus, the Gospels, the other books of the New Testament said nothing against interracial marriage whatsoever. He talked about how, and I appreciate this, what a fine and good and upstanding human being I am, and how amazing my wife is. Those are the things that Dan Lightfoot talked about. But that wasn't the first time. When my wife, I don't think we're dating. I mean, I don't think we're married. I think we were dating at the time. When she visited my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, we paid a visit to this church. I'm just going to name the church, and I'll say it. I don't, I'm not going to say that the church nor all of its congregants hold this belief. Landmark Church of Christ in Montgomery, Alabama. And I remember a classmate of mine. I went to a predominantly white evangelical Christian independent school. And when we showed up at church one Sunday, someone approached us, a former classmate of mine from high school's father, saying, "Does your college actually allow this to happen? Interracial dating?" And he said it almost as if it was a crime against humanity, a sin against society, better yet, a sin against Jesus. And someone needed to say a prayer and ask for forgiveness. Those were the things that really transpired, and it came out of that. And a lot of people, when we think about this, particularly among evangelicals, there are just these theological perspectives that makes evangelical complex intellectually. There's a reason why, right? In college, graduate school, I studied religion. I still write and I still think about this quite a bit. Better yet, I would say that 20th century American race and religion, and even here into the 21st century, drives a lot of the academic work that I do. Evangelical Christians, when we're thinking about their theological underpinnings when it comes to white evangelical Christianity also shapes what I would say the attitudes towards race and racism. While evangelicals tend to emphasize personal salvation, go to YouTube. I'm categorizing some sermons right now for a paper that I'm drafting to get published on urban riots in the 1960s, and I'm particularly paying attention to the city of Memphis, where Brother King was assassinated in the year 1968. So while they may talk a lot about personal salvation and individual morality, when we think about their interpretation of biblical texts regarding race, that's where things get quite interesting because it's somewhat diverse and sometimes contradictory. Some theologians have used scripture to challenge racism and, prompt equality, citing passages that emphasize love, justice, and the intrinsic worth of all individuals, right? Going back to what that awesome Jewish Palestinian brother named Jesus would say. However, on the other hand, we know that there are some who would employ selective readings to justify racial hierarchies and the inferiority of black and brown folks, and then really kind of delve into things as we think about some other contemporary issues today, such as LGBTQ folks, same-sex couples, right? And why that is somewhat sinful and wrong. But it opens up challenges and opportunities for us. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing this to you, for those who are listening, this is Race Matters. You're listening to WJOP 96.3 FM Joppa Radio. And when we think about those challenges and opportunities, addressing racism within white evangelical Christianity allows us to think about how do we move the needle in terms of overcoming entrenched beliefs and practices. And those things require a lot of introspection, dialogue, a commitment to structural changes. And I've seen that for a number of years. I've been on panels, I've given talks, I've attended what's known as the Christian Scholars Conference, hosted at a evangelical Christian college in Nashville, Tennessee, known as Lipscomb University. So that's there. And of course, it's been at other places too. Engaging with diverse perspectives, including those of the marginalized voices, right? My voice, those who are outside the evangelical sphere. And how do we do that? Additionally, as we think about this, theological education and biblical interpretation that center on racial justice, it really can transform and facilitate an unbelievable sense of discourse and engagement. But yet, as I say that, the thing that I'm wrestling with, even in my current research right now, is the question W.E.B. Du Bois once asked, and he published a paper in the Christian Century magazine. And for some reason, I'm drawing a blank on a year. I want to say 1903. Shame on me. I'm a scholar of Du Bois. I've read this article. I've referenced it in countless papers and talks before. But his article was titled, "Will Evangelicals Mend the Color Line?" And the basic premise, of course, in Du Bois's essay was no. He did not think that white evangelical Christians could mend the color line. That was in the 20th century. Here we are in the 21st century, and that is really part of the argument. That is part of the question that we have to delve into. If this topic is of interest to you, if this is something that you tend to lean into and you think about, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to have a conversation. Happy to share my research, my work with you. Happy to tell you, trust me, I've never met an academic or scholar who didn't want to talk about their work, and I am no different. I will do that all day. Engage in the type of discourse that's needed. For those of you who are listening, you say, well, Brother Carson, I'm not evangelical Christian. I'm not even Christian. How is this topic even relevant to me? It's relevant, particularly when we think back to Butler's argument that I mentioned earlier, in the sense that evangelical Christianity has a lot of clout. evangelical Christianity is a driving force, particularly in dictating setting patterns of policies that guide the consciousness of the United States. And of course, it can be a shaper in terms of the furthering of marginalization of all kind of folks that are here. And that's why it's important. It's no mystery that Donald Trump, and not to get all political here, right? I'm only quoting all the things I've read, all the things that I've listened to on YouTube where he doesn't understand the basic interpretation of biblical texts whatsoever. Is trying to sell a Bible and trying to sell a Bible with his signature on it. If I'm evangelical, I'm sitting here thinking, well, isn't that kind of blasphemy? Maybe some folks don't feel that way. I don't know. But it's not going to change in terms of some of the voting patterns that are there. Because as a black man, voting is everything to me. It was what I was raised hearing. It's what I do. It's what I think about. Protecting the franchise and thinking about the importance of my vote in making sure that more folks who want to love me, protect folks who look like me, protect folks who oftentimes have not had the type of voice historically in this country, continue to advocate for the type of social conditioning and progress that is necessary. Folks, that is why you should care. That is why you should care about this topic. That is why this is a topic that oftentimes falls out of the sphere of understanding where most people don't really think about this in a lot of ways. Some folks may say, well, I remember hearing about Billy Graham, for example. And Billy Graham was complicated as the one-time, cross-national, international gospel preacher of the good news known as Jesus Christ. That was Billy Graham. Billy Graham, the former editor of Christianity Today. Those are the things that are there. I appreciate you giving me this time. I have the microphone. You could always reach out to me. If you have any thoughts, any questions, you want to engage in further conversations, I think dialogue is important and is always necessary. Whether you agree with me or you don't agree with me, that is okay. What is important is that you see my human dignity, much like I see your human dignity. And what does that mean to be heard? Folks, this is WJOP 96.3 FM Joppa Radio. I am Eddie Carson. You're listening to Race Matters. Be well. Until next time.